I would like to welcome everyone to the second annual speaker series sponsored by the James Jacobs Civic Engagement Project. The theme for this year's series is Building Block of Democracy, the Role of the Free Press in America. I cannot think of two more distinguished panelists we could have with us today to speak on this matter. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's investigative journalism changed the course of American history. For more than 45 years, their collective works on American government and the presidency have woven in the enduring lessons of Watergate, rule of law, abuse of power, and the role of the press. Our format for today is a Q&A. If you would like to ask one of our panelists a question, simply raise your hand, and Dr. Kingery will come around and bring a mic up to you. But first, please join me in welcoming Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Now I'd like to open the floor to questions.
Hi, I'm Jessica Thompson. Thank you all for being here. My first question would be, what made you pursue journalism? And did you get into journalism out of force? What was your motivation by that?
You should answer, because you started.
We should each answer this one. Usually we don't follow each other with an answer, but his answer's pretty good too.
But he started in journalism at age 5.
That's right. Now, I was in high school. I was a terrible student. I was in high school in the Washington suburbs. And my father could see that I had some ability to write, and being doubtful that I would get out of high school, much less make it on to college, he got me an interview for a job as a copy boy. He knew a columnist at the Washington Star, the afternoon paper in Washington that competed, usually out-reported the Washington Post in those days. And I got an interview for this job. And happily in high school, I had taken typing, and I could type 90 words a minute. And because of that, I took a typing test, and somebody was really impressed by my typing skills. And I got hired as a copy boy at $24 a week in 1960, and I stayed at that paper from 1960 to 65. I'm actually writing a memoir about growing up in this newspaper. I dropped out of college. So it really was where I grew up, was in this newsroom with these amazing people. And here's this 16 to 21, 20-year-old kid with the best seat in the country, going to Kennedy's press conferences, doing all kinds of things that homicides, hanging out with older people who were my mentors. And it was the most fabulous way to grow up that you could grow up. And then Woodward has a really interesting story, because he was in danger of going to law school after being in the Navy, and he can tell you the rest.
So I was 27, I was going to go to law school, and then I did a simple calculation. So law school 3 years, so I'd be age 30 when I got out of law school, and as you know, that's the end of life. And so I tried to get a job at the Post. I had a 2-week tryout, which I failed. They pointed out that I had the opposite problem that Carl had, and that is I was not a good writer. And I worked at a weekly newspaper in the suburbs of Washington for a year, and then they hired me back at the Post because I had some stories at the weekly paper that they wished they'd had.
He was a pretty good reporter when he started.
And then, should we tell them how we started working together? Because that was an accident of nature.
You start to tell.
And I'd been at the Post 9 months, and they had this strange
And
burglary.
the management really loved him, which the rest of us resented.
I was the lowest paid reporter at the Post, and I really loved it, and I think Carl would agree with this about journalism. As he was saying, you go to press conferences, you go talk to people, you see real life, you get to make these momentary entries into people's lives when they're interesting, and then get the hell out when they cease to be interesting. And if you're a doctor, you know, it may be a whole day or week of routine. If you're a lawyer, you know, you may look at, oh, my appointments
Torts.
today.
You got to get through torts.
Yeah,
Forget
and
it.
it can be boring, but I never have found an editor at the Washington Post or anywhere else where they will say to you, okay, let's go find a story that's routine and boring. It necessarily is, and this is the energy of journalism, I think. It's what's going on, what don't we know, what does it mean, what is the impact on people's lives? And it's wonderful to have that sort of job. And so the Watergate burglary, and it was a glorious day.
June 17th, 1972.
A Saturday. And the editors looked around and said, oh, it's so nice out. Who would be dumb enough to come in and work today? And my name immediately came to the top of the list. And so they sent me to the courthouse where the 5 burglars were arraigned, charged.
They had been arrested the previous night at the Watergate wearing rubber gloves, business suits, and carrying sequential $100 bills.
Yes, right. And though only doing night police for 9 months, I had never seen a burglar in a business suit. And so there they were in court, and I'm sitting in the front row, and the judge asked them, where do you work? And the lead burglar, James McCord, said, didn't want to really answer, well, where did you work, the judge asked. And McCord went, CIA. And the judge said, speak up. And McCord went, CIA. And then the judge said, no, say it so we can hear it. And he went, CIA. And I finally heard it in the front row and went, holy shit. Burglars in business suits, a kind of formality, CIA connection. So,
and another one had said when asked his occupation, anti-communist.
That's right, exactly. So then
Then I was in the newsroom that day, and it's interesting that we should be telling this tale today because I was one of 2 of the Washington Post chief Virginia reporters at the time. And that meant that I lived in Richmond during the legislative session. And this week is the end of the legislative session in Richmond, where they're having trouble, as you know. The governor, the lieutenant governor, and now the attorney general. And I thought this was a dream job. I loved being the chief Virginia correspondent because I got to travel all over Virginia, which is a fabulous, wonderful state with this remarkable, conflicted history, which in its way is the history of America. And as well as wonderful people. And I was in the office, I'd come in from Richmond to write a profile about a man running for governor. And I could see this activity around the city desk. I was on what was called the state desk, Maryland and Virginia. And I went up to the desk to find out what all the commotion was about, and I heard about this event at the Watergate, the burglars being arrested. And I said, well, this sounds like a better story than the one I'm working on for the weekend. And so I told the city editor, and I was pretty good at knowing how to use telephones by that time. I'd been in the business, by that point, I'd been in the business for 12 years. And I said, I'll make some calls. And he kind of nodded his assent, and I started making calls to the families of the burglars. Woodward had called in the names of the burglars. And down in Florida, and I called some waiters and other people at the Watergate restaurant. And then later, Woodward came back from the courthouse, and a story was put together that you tell the rest.
Well, no, we're going to actually let somebody else
Right.
ask a question, because
But
we have
right.
become
Right.
insufferably long-winded.
That's right.
And we'll give you a whole
right.
biography.
That's right.
So let's.
Yeah, he's right. But how many of y'all have seen the movie of All the President's Men? Well, then you get a pretty good feel for it in there.
Okay, so this is different, but do you think
You are?
Oh, I'm Amanda.
All right.
Do you think social media has turned people's back on mass media? Random question.
Do you think social media has?
Turned people's back on mass media?
Go ahead, Woodward. Do you think that social media has turned people's backs on mass media?
Yes, somewhat. I mean, the internet is impatience and speed, right? Summarize, give it to me, and answer questions that can't be answered right away. And so, I mean, what we found in working on the Watergate story, we had, bless them, editors who said, take your time, go see people. Carl developed the system, which is central to what we did, of going to people's homes at night, knocking on the doors when you don't have an appointment. And part of that was because Carl, even then, was a renegade, and no one wanted to see him in their office. No, but people are comfortable in their own home, and you found the bookkeeper and the treasurer, and that was the central, and so it demanded patience. And I've often thought, if there was social media at that time, we would have not been tweeting out, oh, gee, went to the Nixon committee treasurer last night. We would be keeping it and trying to find out more and discover what it meant.
Hi, my name is Imani Wilson. So I just wanted to know, I'm familiar with you too, so I just wanted to know, what is your favorite or the most, the article that you're most proud of?
In my case, I would say two. One is a story that Bob and I did together on October 10th, 1972, which was the sum of everything. The Watergate burglary didn't make a lot of sense as an isolated incident. And through some tips and following out, knocking on doors and seeing people, we were able to establish that the Watergate burglary was just one element of a massive campaign of political espionage and sabotage that had been directed by those closest to the President of the United States. And I would put that as the biggest story. And in my case, I think the other story, and I read it, a year or so ago, is I spent about 6 months doing a story for the Washington Post when I was a local reporter about a fascinating group of people called the Wesorts, who lived in southern Maryland. And the name came from we sorts of people are different than you sorts of people. And they're a group of people who were technically known as triracial isolates.
And you did this story.
I
what
did this
year?
story. I did this story probably in 71 or 70.
Before Watergate.
And part white, part African American, part American Indian. And they had evolved over the years. And there are probably 500,000 triracial isolates in different communities, very insular, in the United States. And this group in Maryland is particularly notable because it was possible for me to really find out their history going back to many of their indenture during the colonial period and afterwards, and slavery. because Maryland was a Catholic colony. And so there were parish records. So I was able to take all the skills that I really had learned in journalism and apply them to this tale of this group of people who had persevered, had horrible problems in their own community, and I've just always loved the story. And then I got
Hi, my
Civic.
name's Levi. I was wondering if you think there's any correlation between this presidency and Nixon's.
Over to you.
Easier to describe the creation of the universe. There obviously is some similarity. There are investigations, there are lots of questions, there are so many lies there were in the Watergate-Nixon case, and there are in the Trump case. But Carl and I lived the Nixon case, and we did lots of stories. There were lots of allegations, and the key to unraveling the story and showing precisely what happened and the extent of Nixon's criminality was the revelation and the actual presentation of the secret Nixon tapes. Thousands of hours of Nixon just committing crime after crime after crime. In the case of Trump, we do not yet have that kind of evidence, quite frankly. There are lots of things that point to it. Mueller's investigation is going on very, very intensely. He is the special prosecutor investigating Trump and the Russian connection and anything that comes with it. I recently was looking at interviews I did with Mueller when he was FBI director after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, when you were, 4 or 5, maybe not even born. And one of the things Mueller said, which struck me, he said when he's working on now he's director of the FBI, when they're working on a case, he likes to make sure that you understand the substance and the texture of what's going on, and that you burrow in to the point that you find the people, literally, who have day-to-day responsibility in the organization for what you were investigating. So this, in part, explains the sprawling nature of his investigation. He's looking at everything. Somebody who worked very closely with Mueller for years said to me, what's Mueller like? Because he's a shadowy figure. He doesn't give press conferences. He's very secretive about what they're doing. So what's he like? He said, well, if you rip the mattress tag off and Mueller finds out, he will prosecute you. And some people call him Bobby Mueller, the mattress tag prosecutor. I remember in 4th grade looking at that mattress tag and saying, if you pull this off.
So you go to the electric chair.
At least I thought, wow, one rip and it's a life of crime. And so he's looking at it in a very comprehensive, secretive way. Don't know the answers. I think it's really hard and it's going to turn on the quality of information that's presented. And if Michael Cohen, who was Trump's personal lawyer for 10 years, has tapes, I think that, and those tapes really show what Trump was doing, that will be critical to the investigation. But what do you think?
Agree with everything you say.
Do you have any tapes in there?
That's right.
No, okay.
I think the other factor here is that you're dealing with two very different people. Nixon was a criminal president. He was a criminal president from the day he took office till the day he left office. And his lies were focused on protecting what he had done criminally. Trump is someone who lies about everything, and whose history is really that of a con man. It sounds pejorative when I say it, except it's a repertorial fact. You can check it out, you can show it, you can nail down the cons. And so one of the things the special prosecutor is doing, I believe, and from talking to some of the lawyers around it, is taking the public and private cons involved in what has happened with Russia, whatever that is, and how it relates to Trump. And I think that there's very little question from available repertorial, factual, contextual information that Trump has been manipulated by the Russians, by Putin, either consciously, wittingly, half-wittingly, unwittingly, knowingly, half-knowingly, unknowingly. And it's somewhere, back to what Bob is saying about Mueller and looking at texture and context, he may find the answer definitively and tell this story about Trump and the Russians in terms of the larger cons that have to do with Trump's way of doing business, both in the presidency and before he got there. And maybe along the way, there are tapes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna see if I can, oh, thank you, hi. Excuse me. My name's Charlie. I was pretty young when all that Watergate was being unraveled, and if I can kind of go back to that, I think I'm gonna put this more as an observation, and you can tell me whether you agree with my assessment on this. But I think you left it off where, the way that whole thing started was with these burglars in suits. And when asked their occupation, one said CIA. It was almost like this puzzle that you couldn't ignore. You had to dig deeper. It was just, it presented itself and it needed to be investigated. And I think another factor at that time, we were kind of in a state of, I think there was a lot more disillusion of the younger generation at that time, as opposed to, there was that generation gap. The older generation was saying, never question your government, that's disrespectful. And the younger generation was questioning everything from civil rights and our involvement in Vietnam. And so I think there was that was definitely a factor. Did you feel like you kind of were, you knew you were onto something big, and that the public was behind you, or at least the younger generation might have been behind you in revealing a wrongdoing
No.
as it opened up? Am I rambling too much?
It's the public wasn't behind us.
That's why I said no.
Yeah, and
just the opposite.
But as it revealed itself, did you feel
But it
that?
took a long time, and after we did our major stories, Nixon won a landslide re-election in November 1972. And the key to, you said, well, it had to be investigated.
Yeah, you couldn't ignore it.
It didn't have to be
That's right.
investigated. We had editors who turned us loose, who would say, okay, what about Watergate? Go work on it. Go knock on doors at night. And without that kind of support system, you don't investigate it. And it turned out no one else did. And the conventional wisdom, and I don't really think it was a generational break, but the conventional wisdom was Nixon's too smart to do something like this, and even if he did, you will never find out. It will be concealed and covered up. Of course, it was concealed and covered up, but because we had we could work, I mean, apropos of the question over here about the internet, we could work 2 or 3 weeks on one story, write a draft on 6-ply paper, and any of you remember what typewriters were? And then give copies to all the editors. They would ask questions, we would ask questions, more sources, more detail, and then publish. Now in the environment, Carl does work for CNN. I still work at the Post, and you have something that looks like a minor advance on a story, and someone will say, can we get it on the air in an hour? Or at the, or less, or the Washington Post, can we get it on the website by noon, right away? And so the hydraulic pressure in the system on the editors, producers, and reporters is speed, be first, not really take the time to dig in.
So you don't feel that there was a building public outrage as the story unfolded, maybe later, that, as the public learned more, that maybe, because I guess I'm thinking nowadays, I can't imagine anybody, it's just a different environment now.
There was a process, and give somebody else a chance here in a second, that there was a process that began with the reporting, a lot of it ours, some by the New York Times, some a little bit by Time Magazine. There was what was going on in the courtroom with the burglars and with a courageous judge, Judge Sirica, who used his courtroom and what he had read of our stories to pry open some of the facts. And then you had the Senate Watergate hearings that enabled people to see and hear what the great excesses and illegal acts of the president and the men around him were. And then a consensus perhaps began to develop, and outrage became more pronounced and more cohesive than it had been earlier. But even when Nixon left office, there were still, if you look at the polls, I don't know, 30% of the people, something supposedly supported him.
But those hearings were so important. They were televised live, all the networks, gavel to gavel coverage. And John Mitchell, who had been Nixon's attorney general, his campaign manager, testified under oath on live television, watched by almost unheard ofly large audiences. Mitchell talked about what went on in the White House, and he called them the White House horrors. Remember that? And can you imagine if Jeff Sessions, who was Trump's attorney general, was on live national television under oath saying, oh yeah, the White House horrors, and then started listing.
That's HORRORS.
Right, right.
He's from up the road and talks funny from Chicago.
Thank you. Don't laugh that hard.
My name is Paul, and my question is, even decades after his resignation, a lot of people still idolize Richard Nixon. Why do you think that is? Why do you think people still look at him and think he was a good president, even after you say all these criminal charges have come out and he resigned?
I don't think that, I think there are some who believe that. I'm not a great believer in polls and their absolutism or anything like it, but I think that polls show that it's a rather small percentage of people who believe that. I think there are fanatical Nixon cultists, lovers, whatever. Also, we live in a time where it's very hard for historical fact to hold. There is so much questioning, and back to the earlier things about social media. There's stuff on social media about supposed conspiracies that happened back then that didn't happen. But nonetheless, I think Nixon's reputation for what he did is pretty secure, both in the history books and among most people.
And real quickly, after Nixon resigned, Barry Goldwater, the Republican senator from Arizona who was the conscience of the Republican Party, had Carl and myself up to his apartment in Washington, and he read from his personal diary. And he read from an entry August 7th, 1974, as Watergate was ending, and Nixon had Goldwater and the Republican leaders to the White House. And Nixon knew he was going to be impeached and charged in the House. And so he asked Goldwater, he said, so Barry, how many votes do I have in the Senate? Now, under the Constitution, it would take 34 votes to keep Nixon in office. You would need 67 to remove him. And so Nixon kind of said in an offhanded way, so what do I have, just 20 votes? And Goldwater looked at him and said, Mr. President, I counted the Republicans, and you have 4 votes, and one of them is not mine. And the next day, Nixon announced he was resigning. It was the Republican Party and their judgment on Nixon that led to his resignation. And I think also, given the extent of the tapes and the clarity of what's on there and the closure of Nixon voluntarily resigning, means that his reputation is pretty well sealed.
Hi, my name is Maddie. My question for you is, do you feel that social media can push people away from the voting booths?
Can you just raise your hand? I didn't see you. Okay. I think all kinds of things push people away from the voting booths. I think that we live in a unique situation in our history when one of the 2 major political parties is committed to keeping the vote down. I don't think it's ever happened before in our history, except during the period when we had segregation and blacks were denied voting, as were women before that. But now you have a situation in which literally one party is against the idea of making it as easy as possible for the most people to vote. Why is that? Because that party recognizes that if more people voted, and if you had, for instance, as was discussed the other day in the Senate of the United States, a holiday for voting, and Mr. McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, said no, he would oppose such a thing, and it was just, he was saying it's just a cheap way for Democrats to get votes. So, and social media certainly has a role in that social media promotes very often ideas without factually laying out what the truth is, and often the opposite of the truth. And so we also find it today very hard in our culture, for I think maybe the first time in our history, harder than ever in our history perhaps, to have a fact-based debate in this country, particularly in the Congress of the United States, in the legislatures, but also among people gathering together. And I think it's a huge problem that is debilitating.
Hi, my name's Thomas. I was wondering if you thought that there was a way that we could stop the spread of misinformation or clickbait while still upholding the First Amendment.
I'm sorry,
You want to repeat it again about clickbait and its relationship to the First Amendment? How do you phrased it? You use the mic? You got the mic there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's Trump saying that the news is fake news and that the press is enemy of the people. And I mean, it's on one level outrageous that he says that, but as Carl has pointed out, it's the old Nixon strategy during Watergate in the early 70s. What Nixon did, somewhat skillfully for a while, is say, oh, the real issue here is the conduct of the news media, not the conduct of the president. And Trump, as is his way, has amped up that strategy in a way where it's almost continuous. And I think one of the offshoots of this is people in the press, particularly on cable news, both ways, have become very emotional about Trump, either against him or for him. And I think the more factual and empirical and the cooler we can be about this, the better. But a certain percentage of the people are buying the Trump attack. I don't think it's a majority by any means. And so what's the remedy for us to make our work better, more factual, less emotional, and so it doesn't appear to be partisan?
Hi, my name is Eric. I was wondering if you were familiar with something called Sinclair Media Group.
Yes.
Have you seen any of the recent videos on scripts being delivered to multiple stations and being made to be read instead of, particularly local news stories that pertains to certain areas?
As I recall, there were some stories that went out saying that Sinclair had its affiliates run certain, I'd have to go back and look, but I have a vague awareness of some stories that ran in the press saying that Sinclair, and it became an internal issue of divisiveness among the reporters at Sinclair and employees at Sinclair, that it was perceived by many of them that Sinclair was imposing a political agenda on their affiliates. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. My question was more along the lines of, do you think it's dangerous, particularly to the state of the democracy in the United States, that maybe Sinclair is distributing targeted news advertisements?
I think it's part of a larger question of, I think there are all kinds of dangers to democracy. And certainly, look, there have always been in the media, including hugely popular newspapers, political agendas advocated in the news columns of some of those newspapers. I think we shouldn't be too nostalgic about the history of the press in this country. We have a great history, and we also have plenty of excesses in the history of American journalism, including, remember, early newspapers in this country, like their British models particularly, began as committed instruments to one political movement or another. So the Washington Star, where I went to work, was really an almost mouthpiece for the Lincoln administration. So I think it's just part of a larger phenomenon of all kinds of threats to democracy. But in the case of the press, I'm not too worried, quite honestly, about Sinclair fits to me into right-wing talk radio model to some extent. And there's some on the left, but that's all I can think of to say really about it.
Hi, my name's Nikki. Going back to fake news, how do you think that things being labeled as fake news affects the ability to report what's going on around the world?
Okay, I don't think it should have that much impact, but if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd like to ask everyone there a question, and that is, where do you get information if you're doing a paper or if you're working for the newspaper here? Raise your hand, somebody tell me where you get information.
Search online.
Pardon? Search online, Google, okay. So you've got online, books, documents, the written record. Where else do you get information? Pardon? Bureaus of the government. Okay, but those would be documents, presumably. Where else? Journals, okay, where else? Where else?
How many, in line, one question, how many people here have worked for a school newspaper? Okay.
Where else do you get information here? Facebook. Facebook, okay. Where else?
Interviews.
Human sources, right? Human sources are really, I think, the backbone of reporting, finding witnesses, and so you've got human beings, human sources, documents, the internet, and so forth. Where else do you get information?
Surveys.
Surveys, okay, that's kind of information. Let me tell you a story that answers it, if you'll allow me. In the first months I worked at the Post before Watergate, I found somebody in the health department in the District of Columbia who would give me the sanitation inspection reports of the restaurants in Washington. And it was a sensational series of articles because the more expensive the restaurant was, almost inevitably, the worse the sanitation conditions were.
He was the rat droppings reporter.
Right.
It's true.
Yes, it's true.
And really good at it.
If we could find a report that said there were rat droppings in the restaurant, that got people's attention. And so one morning, the human source in the health department called me and said, I've got the document, the worst sanitation inspection ever given. And so I went and got it, and it was the Mayflower Coffee Shop. Had a score of 50, and because we're going to all have to eat later today, I won't tell you what they found. And showed it to the city editor. He said, oh, that's a great story, front page story. Madison, the Mayflower Coffee Shop, the Mayflower Hotel, famous in Washington on Connecticut Avenue. Said, so write it up and we can have this story done early. So I wrote it up and handed it to him. And he said, have you been there? And I said, no. And he said, well, it's 2.5 blocks away. Get your ass out of the chair and go there. And I kind of thought, picky, right? So I went down to the Mayflower Hotel and said, where's the coffee shop? We don't have one. And you don't have one. Well, we have a buffet and a famous French restaurant. And I was kind of, what's going on here? So I looked at the address of the Mayflower Coffee Shop, and it turned out it was in the Statler Hilton Hotel, which was half a block from the Post. And so I went there, and it was closed for repairs, they said, found the manager who said, oh yeah, well, we had a bad inspection report, got some response from him, and went back to the city editor and said, can I have my copy back? I have a few small changes I would like to make. And so I corrected that it was the Mayflower Coffee Shop in the Statler Hilton Hotel, not in the Mayflower Hotel, and stuck with me the lesson there. What's the lesson? And how does that relate to where else you get information? Personal experience. Go to the scene. See it. When I'm doing books on presidents, from any of them, including Trump, I will get somebody in the White House to take me to the Situation Room, which is what's called the SCIF, Special Compartmented Information Facility. You're supposed to have a top secret clearance, but somebody will take you in there. And I want to see how big the chairs are, what the ambience is, how big the screens, where the screens are placed, where the president sits, where the other cabinet officers sit. Go to the scene. So I think, and that there is not a story you will ever do, there is not a paper you will do for high school, college, anywhere, where you are not going to get information from all three tracks. Human sources, some sort of documentation, some sort of going to the scene, or personal observation, no matter what it is. And so when you're doing a paper, think, how can I expand my experience base to cover at least all of those areas, and hopefully multiple people, multiple documents, and actually visiting what you're writing about.
I think we have time for one final question.
Hi, my name is Julie. I was wondering what you think, what is the role of educational institutions in terms of teaching political knowledge?
I'm thinking. Well, I would hope, and it's just off the top of my head, that educational institutions would, in addition to the predictable sources of books, information in books, that there would be an examination of contemporaneous media. Back to what Bob is talking about, to see what the New York Times is saying about a particular political situation, or how it's reporting on larger cultural questions in which politics figure, how television is looking at it, how news and history as it's being recorded and written figures in the process, in addition to second generation, for instance, history written by people who may not have been alive to observe what they're writing about. I'd like to see more, and I say this having taught like Bob, taught a little bit at the college level. I think we need more that is out of the traditional academic realm.
Yeah, just real quickly, I think it also is training and exposure to a way of thinking. And there is a way of thinking that can help you in whatever you do with the rest of your lives, and it can help you immensely here. And that is that people will say, oh, this is the way it is. This is absolute. And it's not. And if you can get in, Graham Greene, the great novelist, said at one point, he said, do not despise your enemies or people who disagree with you. They have a case. And what he was saying was, you're not necessarily the people who disagree with you or people who are your enemies that you're going to agree, but understand they have a case. There's a basis for their thinking and their conclusions. And part of, I think, a central feature of a college education is to make sure you are as sure as you are what something is. See what the other side is saying. Try to get in their head. It will always help you. And just to go back to the Watergate story, for us, we had experienced, the top political reporters at the Washington Post just telling us, no, Nixon didn't do this. You're never going to find out what I was saying. And they were wrong. And so you have to always be in a frame of mind. This is the information I've got. This is the conclusion I've got. But is there a case on the other side? And make sure you understand that.
One other really good thing that Bob's saying here is, and if you look at the Watergate reporting, none of our sources, certainly none of our major sources, were Democrats.
They were.
They really were all people who were Republicans or worked within the Nixon administration or campaign.
And source Deep Throat, Mark Felt, was the #2 in the FBI.
That's right.
This is a man who was a dedicated Hooverite. J. Edgar Hoover thought Hoover was on the right track and was so, for multiple reasons, offended by what was going on in the Nixon White House. So offended that he did not get the FBI directorship that he was willing to help us. And so that, when Carl first went to the bookkeeper, and it's in All the President's Men, and it's in the movie version very vividly, you're not going in and saying, gee, I know the answers. All I know is you were the bookkeeper and you kept the records of all of this cash that was in a slush fund. Where did it go? And then leading to the key question, who authorized the expenditures of hundreds of thousands of dollars for dirty tricks, espionage, and sabotage? And so the path is not to walk in with, I know the answers.
Have you ever done a story where it turned out the way you initially thought it might? I haven't. I can't think of one that really has. It's always different than your preconceived notion that's gone through your head.
And as you've always said, just get those preconceived notions out of your head.
That's right.
Don't walk in. I mean, you always said, and I think this is vital, beware, be suspicious of true believers on one side or the other, the political side, or if it's not about politics, people who say, now, I mean, here, what's the story in the New York Times? The big astronomer at Harvard now thinks there's life out there.
It's a fascinating story.
Right? Do you think he's right?
I don't know.
I do.
Well, thank you all.